Good evening. I'm Carrie Sanders. I'm the Chief of Mid-County Planning at the Montgomery County Planning Department. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Montgomery County Planning Department's virtual public meeting for Corridor Forward, the I-270 Transit Plan. Corridor Forward is a long-range plan that will prioritize transit solutions for the present and for the future in Montgomery County. Planning for long-term transit for the I-270 corridor and the 46 communities along the corridor is very important for strengthening Montgomery County's economy, promoting community equity, and protecting and improving the environment. Tonight, we will present an overview of the 6 transit options retained for detailed analysis, which were identified in the initial stage of the plan. We will also discuss evaluation metrics that will be used to prioritize the transit options and outline how the responses from the transit value questionnaire that we conducted inform the development of these metrics. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and I will now turn it over to Jessica McVeary to go over other details of this evening. Thanks again.
Thank you, Carrie. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Jessica McVeary, and I'm a master planner with Montgomery Planning. I'm pleased to be here with you this evening to discuss the Corridor Forward plan. Prior to beginning the presentation, I want to cover just a few meeting logistics. During the meeting, you will not be able to unmute yourself to ask a question or provide a comment, but we do want to hear from you, and we will have a dedicated time for questions and discussion following the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question at any point during the event this evening, please click on the Q&A box located in the top right corner of the window on your screen. From the Featured tab, click Ask a Question. This will move you over to the My Questions tab, where you can type a question or a comment. If you joined anonymously, feel free to type your name to let us know who you are, and then click the Send icon to send your message. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for joining us this evening to learn more about Corridor Forward. Tonight, I'm joined by my colleagues Carrie Sanders, Jason Sartori, and Patrick Reed. Over the course of the evening, our team will provide an overview of the Corridor Forward plan, summarize transit options studied through the plan, discuss how these transit options are being evaluated, and share initial results from the evaluation. We'll conclude this evening with questions and discussion, and we do welcome you to submit questions throughout the event in the Q&A box. Next slide, please. So prior to moving into the details of the transit options and the evaluation, I'd like to provide a brief overview of Corridor Forward, the I-270 transit plan. Corridor Forward is considered a functional master plan, which is defined as a plan that addresses an overarching issue or system, such as transportation, historic preservation, or agriculture. Corridor Forward will specifically address transit options for communities and employment centers along the I-270 corridor, but will not address items such as land use or zoning. Next slide, please. Corridor Forward was added to the Montgomery Planning Work Program by the Montgomery County Council with the direction to analyze transit options serving communities along the I-270 corridor between Frederick and Tysons. As you may know, a challenge with this direction is the large menu of transit options, including those that are master planned or frequently talked about in the public sphere, as well as new options that may be under development. In many cases, these options serve different purposes and geographies. The purpose of Corridor Forward, therefore, is to inventory, evaluate, and prioritize the best package of options to inform future funding opportunities. Next slide, please. It's important to note that Montgomery Planning defines the I-270 corridor for the purposes of this plan as the string of communities and employment centers defined by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Government as activity centers, generally between Frederick and Point South in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, which are generally shown in the yellow outline on this slide. Next slide, please. Montgomery Planning began work on Corridor Forward in the winter of 2020, and the Montgomery County Planning Board approved a scope of work for the plan in April 2020, which established an overall approach for the plan. Over the last several months, planning staff have made progress on several elements of the plan, including an inventory of different transit modes, as well as an inventory of approximately 15 conceptual transit options. These conceptual options were evaluated through several indicators, including travel time, population access, job access, ability to accommodate growth, and equitable access. And 6 options were retained for detailed study based on guidance from the Planning Board. This evening, we will present the 6 retained options, the metrics that are being used to compare each of these options, and initial results of the evaluation. Once the evaluation is complete, Montgomery Planning will refine and package options to develop preliminary plan recommendations for presentation to the public, stakeholders, and the Planning Board. Following preliminary recommendations, we will develop an implementation plan to outline the steps necessary to advance these transit options. Next slide, please. While Corridor Forward is a very robust planning process, it is important to note that this plan represents an initial step in planning for transit along the I-270 corridor. While some of the options that will be discussed this evening have been planned or even advanced to preliminary engineering, there are several steps that will follow this planning process to implement the best package of transit options, including funding, environmental review, preliminary design, engineering, and construction. Corridor Forward seeks to identify the highest priority transit projects, but also identify the steps that will be necessary to advance implementation. With this introduction and background, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Patrick Reed, to discuss the options retained for detailed study and how these options are being evaluated.
Thanks, Jessica. I appreciate that. As my colleague Jessica mentioned, we're going to jump into a quick review of the 6 retained options by the Planning Board. Next slide, please. The first option is option A, Enhanced MARC Rail. This option looks at the potential of the existing MARC Rail Brunswick line, assuming that new infrastructure is implemented. That new infrastructure is additional mainline track between Silver Spring and Washington, D.C., new mainline track between Garrett Park and the Monocacy River, and additional mainline track on the Frederick Branch. This option also looks at enhanced service, as well as 2 new stops at Shady Grove and White Flint, which are in the department's master plans today. The infrastructure package reflects what the MTA MARC Rail Cornerstone Plan done in 2018 suggests as additional improvements that are necessary to enhance service along the line. Some of you may be aware as well that rail service is currently under study by the Greater Washington Partnership, who we've worked and collaborated with on this effort. Next slide, please. The next option is option B, a red line extension between Shady Grove and Germantown Town Center. This option proposes 3 new stops at Old Town Gaithersburg, 1 at MD 124 or Fairgrounds, and additional terminus stop at Germantown Town Center. Frequencies are provided consistent with pre-pandemic frequencies at 6 minutes a piece. And I just note here that this is probably anecdotally the most requested improvement that the department in Mid-County and Up-County receive in terms of studying. A portion of an extension was studied by WMATA and the Connect Greater Washington effort from 2014, but was not recommended. And the last point we'd make here is that this option has significant equity focus as it serves a number of the department's equity focus areas. Next slide, please. Option C is the Corridor Cities Transitway. This is a master planned bus rapid transit service with 17 stations connecting Shady Grove, the universities at Shady Grove and Metropolitan Grove to points north in Germantown and CompSat at Clarksburg. It's about 17 miles of dedicated service and is programmed in our model with 5-minute peak hour frequencies. This option is included in multiple department master plans, and 30% design is also complete for the southern portion, which the MTA refers to as Phase 1. The option complements travel between the I-270 corridor communities and employment centers and supports the vision of growth for the Life Sciences Center just west of Shady Grove. Next slide, please. The next option is option D, a Purple Line extension. This option explores the provision of 4 new stops, 1 at River Road and Little Falls Parkway, 1 at River Road and MD 188, which we're calling sort of the Whitman area, and 2 stops in Northern Virginia, McLean and Tysons. The option was modeled with 6-minute headways consistent with planned frequencies for the phase that's currently under construction, and it serves that important travel pattern or travel pair between Bethesda and Tysons. However, the planning team noted that there were multiple alignments that could be beneficial and should be studied, and so we suggest that this option merits its own study and a different effort. We've removed this, or we are going to recommend to our planning board that they remove this option from prioritization due to the need to study multiple alignments in a future effort. And while we are recommending removing it, the plan recommendations are anticipated to discuss the significance of a connection between Tysons and Bethesda, potentially as rail. Next slide, please. Option E is a new rail extension to Frederick. This would provide frequent rapid transit service between the Shady Grove Metro Rail Station and downtown Frederick through the provision of 27.4 miles of new track or elevated guideway. I say elevated guideway here because this was studied as a monorail route, both by the High Road Foundation, which has advocated for a monorail connection between Frederick and Shady Grove, and the MDOT monorail feasibility study, which found this monorail service potentially feasible. We've modeled it here as either a monorail or a light rail to explore the different options that could serve that corridor. And I think the last point we'd make about this one is that it's a more direct connection between Frederick and Shady Grove than what can be achieved today on the MARC rail, which would provide service between Frederick via Point of Rocks to Rockville. Next slide, please. Option F is an I-270 corridor bus rapid transit service. This is a service that provides transit connections between Frederick and Tysons Corner, including 4 different express and local service patterns. The bus is generally assumed to travel in managed lanes with some off-highway dedicated service and some off-highway mixed traffic service. We'd like to emphasize here that the diversions are strategically located to serve communities along the corridor. So the bus is running to travel to serve communities and not expecting people to travel to the bus to take it. Those off-highway diversions are intended to be free flow and in dedicated guideways for the most part. Service for peak stations is anticipated every 15 to 30 minutes, and in off-peak, it's anticipated for every 30 to 60 minutes. Next slide, please. And so this slide is just basically an overview of the different options that we've looked at and retained for study in this effort. Again, the purple line we're recommending to our board be advanced in a different effort to understand what benefits rail could have between Bethesda and Tysons and the best alignments to do so. Next slide, please. Quickly, we'll go through the evaluation metrics and how the questionnaire and feedback that you've provided us responds to these metrics, or how the metrics respond to your feedback from the questionnaire. Next slide, please. There are 4 dimensions that we looked at in terms of evaluation for the project: a strategic dimension, a socioeconomic dimension, a financial dimension, and an implementation dimension. The strategic dimension looks at your typical transit ridership metrics, travel time metrics, VMT metrics, etc. Additionally, in this bucket, we look at equity, environmental resilience, and economic health, so the benefits to each of those 3 plan values. The socioeconomic dimension monetizes those benefits. The financial dimension looks at the operating costs and potential capital costs at a high level for each of the proposed options. And the implementation dimension focuses on a qualitative analysis of the constraints and challenges that would be presented if any of these options were to advance. Next slide, please. And I will quickly turn it over here to my colleague Jessica, who will take us through the results from the transit values questionnaire and help connect those with some of the dimensions that we'll be looking at through this effort.
Thanks, Patrick. As many of you may recall, last fall, Montgomery Planning published an online transit values questionnaire to understand travelers' values and priorities for transit along the I-270 corridor. As of yesterday, the questionnaire has received 285 unique responses from respondents throughout the county and the region, and the responses are being used to inform consideration of the transit options and their respective performance. So during the next few slides, we'll highlight some of the responses received on the questionnaire to date. In general, results are suggesting that the highest priorities of the respondents are to realize transit benefits in the near term, to serve existing centers of activity, and to serve existing equity needs, rather than to focus on long-term benefits or serving areas designated for growth. The responses suggest an overall desire to support options that advance a balance of environmental, economic, and equity benefits. Respondents indicate that the primary reasons that they chose not to take transit today are because other options are more time competitive and because stops are not convenient. Respondents suggest that they care more about making transit travel time competitive with automobile travel rather than reducing congestion, and also want a balance between convenient access and short travel times between major stops. Next slide, please. As shown in the chart on the right side of the slide, the questionnaire results suggest that no single option can satisfy all preferences and that there are trade-offs to the options. For example, some options offer reliable and frequent service, but are more challenging to implement, whereas other options may be easier to implement, but offer less frequent or reliable service. Next slide, please. Based on the feedback from the questionnaire, staff is considering a package of transit recommendations that consider the following feedback: advancing high-performing options despite implementation challenges and acknowledging a long-term time horizon, prioritizing service for existing centers of demand in marginalized communities and focusing less on areas slated for growth, balancing local access with efficient travel, and focusing more on improving transit travel times and less on reducing congestion. I'll now pass the presentation back to Patrick to discuss the preliminary findings.
Thanks, Jessica. Next slide, please. So we'll be focusing today on some preliminary findings in the strategic dimension. Later, as the effort advances, more information about the other dimensions, including the socioeconomic dimension, the financial dimension, as well as the implementation dimension, will be available. First, in the left-hand side of your screen, a depiction of new daily transit trips is shown. This is a system-wide metric, right? So it's not necessarily just new people taking MARC or new people taking option B, red line extension, but the new transit trips introduced at a system-wide level. The blue on the bar graph indicates the new trips that are regional in nature, and the black indicates new transit trips that are located within Montgomery County. As you can see, there's a varying degree of trip patterns. So for example, option C suggests that the new trips are mostly focused within Montgomery County, which makes sense. And something like option E, a new rail connection to Frederick, is slightly depicting more regional benefits. On the right-hand side of your screen, this bar graph depicts annual VMT reduction in millions. And so you can see, and by VMT, I mean that as vehicle miles traveled, which is a measurement that transportation planners use to assess congestion and how many autos are on the road. You can see that the benefits of option B and option E are quite pronounced here, and that these options do the best job of reducing VMT by providing new transit connections. On the next slide, please. Land use is important when we model our transportation projects and network. This series of bar graphs here depicts the results of modeling for 2015 and 2045. If you assume 2015 as a floor for performance, you can understand which options are dependent on us achieving our growth in order to achieve performance. So if you look at option C, E, and F, these options show good performance in 2045, but the delta or change between performance in 2015 is greater than something like option A, the enhanced MARC rail, or option B, the red line extension, which suggests there is a need for these services today. Next slide, please. The strategic dimension also assessed accessibility. So we looked at new households within a 15-minute walk of transit for each option. So the new stops that are provided by each option offer new access to the high-quality premium transportation network. As you can see, option F, the I-270 corridor BRT, is an option that, because of its geographic span, adds quite a bit of accessibility to the network from the perspective of adding new 15-minute walk access. On the right-hand side of the screen, this option looks at new jobs accessible within 45 minutes. Now, it's important to note here, this is not a modeled result, so it's not necessarily suggesting ridership to these jobs, but which jobs or how many new jobs are accessible. The two charts differentiate between equity areas and non-equity areas to help people understand the benefits to our equity-focused communities here in the county. As you can see in the chart on the right, which focuses on job access, there's a significant benefit to option B, the red line extension, which shows that because these new stops are located within areas of equity focus for the county in Gaithersburg, MD 124 Fairgrounds, and also Germantown, and by providing a high capacity, high frequency service, there is significant benefit to folks residing within this area because they can now access jobs more easily within the red line corridor that extends into Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. This dashboard just shows a summary overall of the different metrics. Some takeaways here are the emerging direction is that option B, red line extension, is showing some significant performance. Option E and option F also show positive gains as well as some regional benefit. And option C suggests that there is significant benefit in the region for local transit trips and significant demand for travel in the Life Sciences Center corridor. Next slide, please. I'll quickly go through the schedule and the next steps. Next slide, please. Right now, the project team is continuing to coordinate with the public and external agencies. We'll be drafting preliminary recommendations as our evaluation continues. In September of 2021, we anticipate bringing these preliminary recommendations to the Planning Board. In October, we plan to bring the working draft to the Planning Board, which would set up a public hearing in November of 2021. This would mean that Council would begin their review in late winter or early spring of 2022. Next slide, please. In terms of what this means for you, we definitely want to hear from you, and we'd encourage you to do a couple different things. First off, we'd encourage you to share your transit story, which is a social media campaign that we'll get into just in a moment here. We also would encourage folks to attend a preliminary recommendations meeting, which will have more information about the performance of each option, which we will advertise on our website, as well as testify at the Planning Board and Council at the appropriate times. In November of 2021, the public hearing would occur at the Planning Board, and you can sign up on the Planning Board's website to testify. And anticipated again in spring of 2022, County Council review would offer opportunities to testify at their public hearings as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the media campaign that we just mentioned, we're hoping that if you're interested, you'd be willing to share your transit experience with us on social media using the hashtag #CorridorForward or using the link that's shown in the tiny URL here. And this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So if you can't access the chat now and need to reference it later, feel free to stay tuned on our website. The URL will be available. So we're publishing these stories to help people understand the importance and crucialness of transit, both in today's post-pandemic world, but also our experience prior to the pandemic. We've heard a lot from folks who are out there. Essential workers are telling us they depend on transit to get around. We've also heard from people who suggest that despite the effects of the pandemic, they're still using transit because it provides an efficient means of travel, and they also have personal values about climate advocacy, or it's a cost-effective or travel time efficient option for them. If you have any of these experiences or have any other experiences you'd like to tell us about, please do consider using the hashtag #CorridorForward or the URL to share your experience with us. Next slide, please. And that about wraps up the presentation that we have. I'll turn it over to my colleague Jessica to provide some preliminary guidance about the Q&A session.
Thanks, Patrick. So just as a reminder, and we do have several questions coming in, but for those of you that may have joined a little later, just want to remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A box located in the top right corner of the window, and from the featured tab, click Ask a Question. So bear with me while I sort through the questions and then ask them of my colleagues on the call. I'm going to start with a question to Patrick. Could you talk a little bit about ridership for the MARC option? The specific question was about the MARC extension. I see extensions, but are there enough people to ride it? This was a concern in West Virginia when they were fighting with the Montgomery County Department of Transportation in previous discussions.
Thanks for the question. And it's a good one because as you saw on the charts that the new system-wide ridership for high quality transit isn't as high for the MARC rail option as it was for some of the other options. This is for a couple different reasons. The frequencies of MARC, while they're increased with our modeled options because of the new infrastructure that's proposed, it's just not the same level of frequency that you get from some of the other options that we looked at, such as the WMATA Red Line extension or the CCT. Additionally, a number of the stops along the Brunswick line are located in areas that are not slated for growth and lower density today. So in our agricultural reserve, you have stops like Boyd's, et cetera, that we don't anticipate significant growth, the density that you'd see at a more developed place like Rockville. And so for this reason, the ridership is not performing quite as well as some of the other options.
Thanks, Patrick. Sticking with MARC for just a moment, we also have a question about the headways for MARC and why the MARC off-peak headways are shown at 1 hour. What if it was also 15-minute during off-peak periods?
So the off-peak I just want to make sure I heard the question correctly. The question was in regard to off-peak headways, correct?
Yes.
And so off-peak in this particular case, we look at the peak hour and typically when we model these things, and we also look at the non-peak direction as well. And so some non-peak direction was also modeled for this effort. The off-peak headways, I think there's a balance, right, between the level of service you can provide and the ridership that you anticipate to gain. And I think the project team worked to kind of get a sense of what the demand would be for off-peak service. And we wanted to make sure we could start with something in the model that could be realistically conceivable and achievable, rather than project something that might overestimate the value of the potential service. I think we wanted to take a pretty pragmatic approach. And so that's why the headways are a little bit reduced from what would be completely ideal.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm also going to ask one of the questions related to the CCT, and I will ask our Division Chief of Countywide Planning and Policy, Jason Sartori, to share the response that he provided on the Corridor Cities Transitway and why it's one of the options that we are covering in the presentation this evening.
Sure. Thank you, Jessica. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jason Sartori. I'm Chief of the Countywide Planning Policy Division here at the County Planning Department. So the CCT, we're including it because it's still a very important part of our corridor, the 270 corridor. It's still an element, a significant element of many of our long-range plans. Even if it doesn't have the state funding. So it's not that the CCT was canceled. The state just isn't funding it, although they have already invested a good deal of money in that project. And so if that project moves forward without state funding, it would have to be a county project. And we still see it as a vital component of the life sciences area of the 270 corridor. And so it was definitely something that we wanted to take a look at as part of this project.
Thanks, Jason. We have a few questions related to the red line, and I will turn back to Patrick Reed to offer some initial responses to these questions. Can you talk a little bit more about how the rail would get into the Germantown Town Center? And also a little bit more about the route of the red line extension that we are studying currently, including where it may be at grade or where it would be below grade?
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you. So the red line extension option that we looked at is an alignment that extends along the CSX right-of-way until reaching MD 118 or so. There's a sort of a curve onto 118, right where the CSX right-of-way is there. So the red line can travel onto MD 118 and make its way toward the transit center over in Germantown. There's, I think, a component of the question was about whether or not we've considered it as an at-grade service, whether or not we've considered it as an elevated service. For this particular effort, we're considering it an at-grade service until it gets to that point of diversion at MD 118. So that's what's built into our assumptions regarding cost and things like that. In terms of like a below grade service, there's a sense that that might be cost prohibitive for the corridor, but things can change over time, right? And so if this project were to be recommended in our master planning effort, the implementing agency down the line, whether it be, within the next 10 years, the next 25 years, would go ahead and they'd have to do probably a NEPA analysis for this extension. And that would look at several different alternatives. And it's likely that the build alternatives would include different alignments. So different alignments as well as different assumptions about being at grade, being above grade, and things like that. So most of our master plan and functional plans, they recommend things at sort of a preliminary level. And as Jessica mentioned early in the presentation, the next steps down the line when our decision makers advocate for and fund these things would be a more comprehensive analysis of what the potential could be for an actually constructed transit option.
Thanks, Patrick. For this question, I'm going to ask our Division Chief of the Mid-County Planning, Carrie Sanders, to respond. The question was, Metro Extension would really improve the economic options in the I-270 corridor. What is the probability for funding? Would all funding come from WMATA, or would the county and state pitch in?
Thank you, Jessica. And I see Marilyn Bullcombe, who's our candidate for county council, has asked this question. Thanks for asking the question. I believe that, with these types of projects, I've worked on a number of them in Northern Virginia in a prior role. These large capital projects really are a combination of funding sources. None of these projects, to give you an example, I worked on the Potomac Yard Metro Rail Station project in Alexandria for a number of years, which is now under construction. That project comes through funding sources at the state level, at the federal level, and certainly at the local level. So something like the Metro Rail extension, if that was to move forward in Montgomery County, would need to have a number of funding sources. It would not be solely funded by WMATA, and of course the the funding that WMATA receives is obviously regional funding and federal funding. So you know, a large capital project like that would definitely be a great candidate for grants at the federal level. It would also be a great candidate for other types of funding. There could be toll revenue. If there is a toll revenue source in Montgomery County, that could potentially fund that as well. So there are lots of different options for funding, and I think that's a really good question, because we're through this project, we are thinking about how things will be funded. And we will have some of that discussion in the plan, particularly when we talk about implementation in the plan. We will have a more detailed discussion about funding.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm going to turn back to Jason with this question. And that is the goal to only choose or recommend one of the options that we've discussed this evening? It seems like, and this is from the commenter, a combination of options would potentially have the best results. If we want immediate solutions, something like the Red Line extension would likely take a lot longer than BRT.
That's a good question, in that we're actually, one of our next steps is to kind of take a look at potential packaged runs, ways that some of these options can potentially be tweaked or combined in some way to take a look at different combinations that could potentially serve the purpose even better. And so we're going to go to the planning board next week, and we'll get some feedback on these options that we've looked at now, and then we're going to look at some of those packaged runs. Now, in the end, because there are multiple purposes served by each of these different options, and potentially even by the different packages, that it's really going to be more of a prioritization, and not necessarily saying this is the one, or you know, there may be some that end up falling out, but it will be really a prioritization rather than a selection of one project as the project to move forward.
Thanks, Jason. There are also a few questions related to costs and implementation, and I will ask Patrick to provide responses to these questions. I do want to just remind folks that we had mentioned earlier in the presentation that this is really early in the process. We are looking at this from a planning level perspective, not from a detailed engineering or design perspective, and also are not at the level of detail where we would be thinking about very focused funding mechanisms. And so I did want to state that at a high level, but I will ask Patrick if he can talk a little bit about the rough order of magnitude cost for the solutions, and if that's something that is being explored or considered through this process.
That's a great question, and I appreciate it. And the initial comment about the importance of recognizing that this is a high-level planning effort is important. And we can't reiterate enough that when it comes time to design and engineer these things, a closer look is taken and much more details provided about costs. However, through this effort, we do have our financial dimension to provide sort of a high-level assessment of what costs could be for each option. What's accounted for in those costs, I think, is probably the natural question. So we think about things like the alignment, to the question that was earlier, whether or not it's below grade, above grade, if it is at grade, and we look at similar systems to help us develop an estimate about a per mile cost for what that potential piece of capital could be. We've also built into our assumptions some things like OMF, or operating and maintenance facilities, which, you know, for some of these options, you need to have an operating and maintenance facility, and you need to account for the land value. We've added a contingency to each option to kind of give it some buffer, because costs can grow as things, you know, are actually implemented, and so we've taken that into account. On the operating side, we've used the National Transit Database, which is a database that the FTA uses to kind of provide reporting and clear transparency about the costs associated with operating different kinds of options. So we've used that to kind of gauge the operating costs, as well as some other similar systems in the region for each of the options that we're looking at on the operating side. So as the project advances, you'll be able to get some more information about the high-level capital costs that are projected with each of the options that are shown, as well as the high-level assessment of operational costs associated with each option. Happy to take any additional questions about costs if they come up.
Thanks, Patrick. There is one additional question more related to implementation of the options in terms of right-of-way acquisition, opening systems, the cost of land acquisition, and whether or not these components are something that we are evaluating through the process at the high planning level.
It's a great question because some of the options obviously have a much larger footprint than others. We did do a desktop analysis, and by desktop, we refer to that being we've gone into our GIS and did a basic assessment of how much right-of-way we think at a planning level would be necessary beyond what exists today. That can obviously change as a project moves into design, but it's an initial take at how much right-of-way is necessary. Projecting costs of right-of-way is challenging. Costs of land change all the time, so we do have some high-level assumptions, and a lot of that is factored into our contingency. But we did look at the footprint, the right-of-way impacts of the footprint, and I think that information will be something that will be available as the project advances. Just at a high level today, we can tell you that the red line extension, the footprint of that service is a little bit larger than something like MARC. And if you could start to consider options like monorail, obviously the footprint is pretty good for something like that as an elevated service. Our bus services can be designed to be flexible. They can either run in mixed traffic, but what we're proposing here is some dedicated services. That would mean either right-of-way expansion or repurposing auto capacity. And so the impacts of that, would remain to be seen. But that's a long way of saying that, yes, we have accounted for that. I'd also note that we have the implementation dimension, which we haven't really focused on in this conversation, but it does look at things like impacts to structures, as well as some of the challenges on the regulatory side and the funding side about how complex it would be to advance each option. That's sort of a qualitative analysis where we assign a value and a score to each option based on those, different components of implementation. We also factored into that bucket things like historic impacts, environmental impacts, and things like whether or not the complexity of the operating model is such that it would be pretty challenging to move forward. So yeah, if there are any additional questions about the implementation side too, we can certainly speak to those in this meeting here as well.
Thank you, Patrick. I think that I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about one of the questions that we have received quite frequently over the course of this project. As I mentioned, we started this project in the winter of 2020, which, as I'm sure you all know very well, was a tough time to initiate a project, and we have encountered a question quite frequently about why now, and will folks ride transit as we return to normal from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd like to turn to Carrie Sanders and ask if she might be able to provide a response to this question about returning from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm really glad that this question was asked because obviously the pandemic is sort of at the top of everybody's mind these days, front of our thoughts. And I think one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning as we kicked off this meeting is Montgomery County has sort of three main values that we're focused on with this plan, and also as we do plans throughout the county, we are very focused on the economy, making sure that our economy is healthy, equity, making sure that we have community equity, and thirdly, the environment. So those three values have really guided this effort. And, you know, those values really came to play as well during the pandemic. And, you know, kind of speaking to the first value of the economy, many industries were hit very hard by the pandemic. And we, you know, creating new jobs is very important, not just for Montgomery County, but for the region. And transit construction, transit-oriented development, all of those things create jobs today that will keep the county competitive in the future. And also, many employers, as they look to locate in the region, are very, very focused on locating by transit. As Amazon considered locations in the region, they located at a metro station and were very focused on how they could locate their headquarters by transit. So we really do feel this plan is relevant in this era of the pandemic. To also talk about equity, which is also extremely important. Transit is not only vital for commuting to work, but it's also for transporting people that are looking for work. We must continue to serve our transit-dependent populations and plan network improvements for not only reliable service, but also service that is efficient, where folks can get to where they need to go without sitting in traffic. And then thirdly, the environment. So through the pandemic, we've also witnessed extreme weather and the growing impacts of the climate change. So the climate changing. So this these 6 options that we're talking about reduce our carbon footprint, and that's something that's going to be very important as we plan for the future. So we do feel that, you know, looking at other pandemics throughout history, transit has always recovered, and we feel confident it will again, and it's already started to. So hopefully that addresses your question, and thanks so much for asking it, because I do think it's an important topic.
And if I could, I just want to add one more thing to I thought was a really great response there, Carrie, is that just last week we had some planning staff who presented our travel monitoring report to the planning board, and I'm going to drop a link to that, the summary report, and maybe a few of the other data dashboards that we have with it. But in particular, there's some information in there about, you know, it's all about transportation trends in the county, and we're showing some data that indicate that WMATA and ride-on bus service is getting back up to pre-pandemic levels. And so that's important to note that even through the pandemic, there's a good core of our population who is still very transit dependent. And it's been good to know that that's been there and that it's been available for free for county residents too. So I'll drop a link to that report so that people can take a look at that.
Thanks, Carrie and Jason. Shifting gears once again, I'd like to go back to Patrick and ask that you talk a little bit about, well, the question is, how will this planning process provide input into the state's I-270 expansion project? So could you talk about this project a little bit in relation to the state's work?
Sure, thanks, Jessica. It's a great question, and I think it's probably confusing for folks that there's a lot going on right now in the public sphere related to the I-270 corridor. And I appreciate the question because I think it gives us the opportunity to kind of clarify that a little bit. Our department is doing this as a separate effort from the state's work. We are not, you know, working in tandem with SHA. Not to suggest that we have any, I would suggest that it is just a separate effort from SHA looking at the benefits of transit in the corridor. And so basically the way we envision this project is to support transit regardless of whether or not the managed lanes advances or does not advance. And if it advances and offers opportunity for funding, that's great. If it, you know, advances and doesn't, we still feel like that this project has independent utility because we'll have looked at the potential to serve communities along the corridor with transit. And so we can't really stress that enough, and that this is an effort that's looking at the independent utility of transit separate from any kind of enhancement to the highway. So I appreciate the question, and invite any of my colleagues to clarify if they want to add anything.
All right, thank you, Patrick. It looks like the questions are slowing down a little bit. If you do have any other questions, please do feel free to put them into the Q&A box. And what I might ask my colleagues to do is to share the last slide so that we can give you our contact information. So if you do have any questions, once we leave tonight, you are always welcome to reach out to the project team and, set up individual conversations, give us a call, send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. So if I could ask that the last slide be added for the contact information. Great, thank you so much. So just want to share both Patrick Reed's contact information as well as our colleague Jessie Cohn McGowan, who is working on this project in close coordination with Patrick, but was unable to join us this evening, unfortunately. So we do welcome you to reach out to us if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss the project in greater detail. We welcome you to contact us at this contact information. And also, we'd like to encourage you to visit our website for more information, which is montgomeryplanning.org/corridor forward. And we can certainly include a link to that, to our project website in the chat as well for tonight. And, if there are questions that we didn't get to specifically tonight, we will certainly follow up and provide more responses on our website for items that we weren't able to cover this evening. We're very grateful to all of you for joining us tonight for this community meeting. And we look forward to coming back to the community early this fall with some additional results from our analysis and also preliminary recommendations. So with that, I think we will say thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to reconnecting with you early this fall.